Every age has its figures who appear at crossroads, men and women who challenge the order of their day, who force their societies to face uncomfortable truths. Some are remembered as heroes, others as villains, but all of them leave ripples that extend far beyond their lifetime. In the history of Rome, one such figure stands out: Tiberius Septimius Gracchus, a man of noble birth, yet champion of the poor, a soldier who fought for Rome's empire, yet returned to finding the Republic crumbling, a reformer who tried to heal the widening gap between rich and poor, but in doing so, unleashed a storm of violence that would change Rome forever. This is not just the story of a man, it is the story of a republic under strain, of inequality and corruption, of ideals clashing with ambition, and it is the story of how one act of political courage, or recklessness, depending on who tells it, opens a door that Rome can never close again. This is the story of Tiberius Gracchus. To understand Tiberius, we first need to understand Rome in the middle of the 2nd century before Christ. By the year 133 BCE, Rome had become the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. Carthage, once Rome's greatest rival, had been utterly destroyed in the Third Punic War. Macedonia and Greece had fallen under Rome's control. Vast provinces stretched from Spain in the west to Asia Minor in the east. The Republic had never been richer, never more powerful, but beneath this triumph, cracks were spreading. The Roman Republic was founded on a delicate balance, a mixture of aristocratic senate, elected magistrates, and popular assemblies. It was a system that prized tradition and compromise. For centuries it had worked, but empire changes a people. The endless wars had brought back treasures, slaves, and new lands. The spoils of the conquest flowed into the pockets of the elite. Wealthy senators bought up farmland, building enormous estates known as latifundia. These estates were worked not by Roman citizens, but by the slaves captured in war. Meanwhile, the small farmer, the backbone of Rome's citizen army, was squeezed out. Many lost their land, drowning in debt, and were forced to seek work in the city. Rome itself swelled with unemployed citizens, restless and hungry. Grain shortages became common. Corruption thrived, and the Senate, dominated by the wealthy elite, did little to address the growing crisis. It was into this world that Tiberius Gracchus was born. Tiberius was not a nobody. He belonged to one of Rome's most distinguished families. His father, Tiberius Septimius Gracchus the Elder, had been a celebrated general and twice consul. He was remembered as a man of dignity, who once brokered peace with Spain in a way that spared Roman lives. His mother, Cornelia Africana, was even more famous. She was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the hero who had defeated Hannibal in the Second Punic War. Cornelia became the model of Roman motherhood, famed for her education, her wisdom, and her devotion to her children. The Gracchi household was steeped in Roman tradition, patriotism, service, and the belief that the Republic was worth preserving. Cornelia raised her children with a sense of duty and ambition. According to legend, when other women boasted of their jewels, Cornelia pointed to her sons and said, "These are my jewels." Tiberius grew up in the shadow of greatness, surrounded by the memory of Scipio Africanus and the expectations of his noble line. But he also inherited something else, a sense of responsibility towards Rome. Born around 163 BC, Tiberius Gracchus was a child of privilege, but not of indulgence. He was educated in Greek philosophy and Roman law, trained in oratory, and taught the values of discipline and service. He was said to be quiet, thoughtful, and reserved, not as fiery as his younger brother Gaius, but with a strong sense of justice. As he came of age, Tiberius entered public life in the traditional Roman way, through military service. In 147 BCE, Tiberius served under his cousin Scipio Aemilianus in the final war against Carthage. The young noble distinguished himself for courage and intelligence. He was among the first to scale the walls during the assault on Carthage, and he fought with bravery in a brutal street fighting that followed. Later, he was sent to Spain, where Rome faced fierce resistance from local tribes. It was here that Tiberius saw firsthand the suffering of Rome's common soldiers. He noticed that many soldiers were poorly equipped, forced to fight long campaigns while their farms back home fell into ruin. When they returned, they often found their lands seized by wealthy neighbors. The seed was planted. Rome's empire was built on the sacrifice of its citizens, yet those very citizens were being cast aside. Tiberius's reputation as a brave soldier and thoughtful officer paved the way for his entry into politics. He rose through the cursus honorum, the ladder of Roman offices. In 137 BCE, he was elected quaestor, a financial officer. Serving in Spain again, he negotiated a controversial peace treaty that saved thousands of Roman lives, but angered the Senate. Though the treaty was annulled, Tiberius returned to Rome with the admiration of the people. He was seen as a man who cared more for soldiers than for senatorial pride. By the early 130s BCE, his path led him to the office that would define his destiny, Tribune of the plebs. The office of tribune was one of Rome's most unusual creations. Tribunes were sacratorians. Their persons were legally untouchable. They had the power to veto any law or action they believed harmed the people, and they could propose legislation directly to popular assembly. It was a role designed to protect ordinary citizens from the abuse of the elites. In 133 BCE, Tiberius was elected tribune of the plebs, and almost immediately, he used that office to launch the most radical reform Rome had seen in centuries. Tiberius proposed a law to address Rome's growing land crisis. The Lex Sectorium Agraria, or the Agrarian Law, would limit the amount of public land an individual could hold. Excess land would be taken back by the state and redistributed to the poor citizens. In theory, this was nothing new. Old laws limiting land ownership had existed, but were ignored for generations. Tiberius was simply reviving them. But in practice, this was revolutionary. It meant stripping the wealthy elites of land they had held for decades. For the poor, it promised hope. It returned to farming, independence, and dignity. For the elites, it was a direct attack on their wealth and power. The Senate resisted fiercely. They claimed Tiberius was a demagogue, stirring up the mob. They warned that his plan would destabilize Rome. But Tiberius pressed forward. He bypassed the Senate entirely and brought his law directly to the assembly of the people. This was a turning point. By breaking tradition, Tiberius challenged the Senate's authority. And in Rome, tradition was everything. Tiberius was not alone. He had allies among young nobles and reformed-minded senators. His mother, Cornelia, gave him moral strength, and the common people rallied behind him, seeing him as a champion who finally spoke for them. But he also gained powerful enemies. The Senate, dominated by the landed elite, were outraged. They feared the president. If Tiberius succeeded, others might follow. Their wealth, their estates, even their political dominance could be threatened. One man in particular stood in his way: Marcus Octavius, another tribune of the plebs. Octavius represented the interest of the wealthy. He used his power of veto to block Tiberius's law. Day after day, he vetoed every attempt to bring the reform to a vote. The Republic was paralyzed. Tiberius faced a choice: accept defeat or push the boundaries further. And he chose to push. In an unprecedented move, Tiberius called on the assembly to depose Octavius from office. The law was clear: a tribune was sacratorial. But Tiberius argued that Octavius, by betraying the people, had forfeited his sacred duty. The assembly voted. Octavius was removed. The agrarian law was passed. For the poor, it was a victory. For the Senate, it was a declaration of war. Tiberius had broken the unwritten rules of Roman politics, and once those rules were broken, they could not be mended. The storm was gathering. When the assembly voted to depose Octavius and pass the agrarian law, the forum erupted with cheers. For Rome's poor, it was a moment of triumph. At last, someone in power had defied the Senate and delivered justice. Families dreamed of farms restored, of livelihoods regained. But for the Senate, the moment was terrifying. Never before had a tribune been removed from office by popular vote. Never before had one man so brazenly cast aside Roman's tradition. Tiberius had won his law, but he had also made himself the most dangerous man in Rome. The agrarian law established a three-man commission to oversee the redistribution of land. Tiberius appointed himself, his younger brother Gaius, and his father-in-law, Appius Claudius Pulcher, to the board. Almost immediately, they set to work. Surveyors went out to measure estates, to determine whether the land exceeded the legal limits and could be reclaimed. Resistance was fierce. Wealthy landowners filed endless legal challenges, stalling the process. Many refused to cooperate at all. The Senate provided little funding to support the new settlers. Tiberius, undeterred, sought new ways to strengthen his reforms. But in so doing so, he again broke with tradition. In 133 BCE, Rome received shocking news. Attilius III, king of Pergamum in Asia Minor, had died without an heir. In his will, he left his kingdom and all its treasures to Rome. It was an extraordinary gift, an entire Hellenistic kingdom, rich with wealth and fertile land. Traditionally, the Senate controlled foreign policy and providence revenue, but Tiberius saw an opportunity. He proposed that Pergamum's treasure be used to fund his land reform. The Senate was outraged. Tiberius had crossed yet another line, seizing power that had always belonged to them. To the Senate, it was no longer about land reform. It was about survival. If Tiberius could strip them of wealth, land, and foreign authority, what would remain of their power? Tiberius' one-year term as tribune was drawing to a close. Normally, a tribune served only once. But Tiberius feared that once he left office, his enemies would destroy everything he had built, and perhaps destroy him as well. So he made a fateful decision. He would run for tribune again. This was unprecedented. It wasn't technically illegal, but it violated Rome's political customs. To the Senate, it looked like an act of tyranny, a man seeking permanent power. Rumors swirled that Tiberius aimed to make himself king, the very word that Rome hated above all. The stage was set for a showdown. The election day of 133 began like many others. Citizens gathered in the field of Mars, lining up to cast their votes. But tension hung in the air. Supporters of Tiberius crowded the space, determined to re-elect their champion. Senators and their clients moved through the crowd, spreading whispers, stirring anger. Suddenly, chaos erupted. A group of senators, led by Cornelius Scipio Narcissa, the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priests, stormed into the assembly with their followers. They carried clubs and staves, weapons hastily snatched from benches and construction sites, shouting that Tiberius was a tyrant. He aimed at kingship. They charged into the crowd. Tiberius tried to flee, but in the crush of the crowd, he stumbled. His supporters attempted to shield him, but the mob was relentless. He was struck down, beaten to death with wooden clubs. Dozens of his followers were slaughtered beside him. The body of Tiberius Gracchus, tribune of the plebs, was thrown in the Tiber River. Rome had not seen bloodshed like this in centuries. The Republic had crossed a line from which it would never return. The news of Tiberius's death spread like wildfire. For the Senate, it was a grim relief. They had destroyed their enemy, but in doing so, they had also destroyed the illusion that Rome's politics could remain peaceful. For the people, it was a betrayal. Their champion had been murdered in broad daylight, not in a battle against a foreign foe, but at the hands of his own fellow citizens. Riots shook the city. Fear spread through the elite. Never again would Romans believe that the Republic was immune to violence. At the heart of the tragedy stood Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi. She had raised her sons with the highest ideals, taught them to serve Rome with honor, and now her eldest lay dead, struck down not by the Carthaginians or the Spaniards, but by the Romans. Cornelia refused to retreat into mourning. Instead, she kept the memory of Tiberius alive, telling the story of his courage and vision. In the years to come, she would see her younger son, Gaius, take up Tiberius's cause, and meet a similar fate. The Gracchi brothers became martyrs, their deaths making the beginning of a new, darker age. Tiberius Gracchus failed in his lifetime. His reforms were stalled. His enemies triumphed. His body discarded like refuse. But his ideas lived on. The land commission continued, slowly redistributing land. His brother, Gaius, would carry the torch of reform even further, pushing for grain subsidies, citizen rights, and broader economic change. Most importantly, Tiberius's death shattered the old rules of Roman politics. Before, disputes were settled through debate, compromise, and tradition. After Tiberius, violence became an acceptable tool of politics. His assassination was the first political murder in the late Republic. It would not be the last. From that day forward, blood would flow more easily in Rome. What do we make of Tiberius Gracchus? He was a noble reformer, a man of vision who tried to save Rome from its own inequality. Or was he a reckless radical, a demagogue who shattered tradition and unleashed violence? Perhaps he was both. His story reminds us of the fragility of republics. Rome was not brought down by foreign enemies, but by internal division, by the refusal of the powerful to share, by the desperation of the poor, and by the collapse of political norms. Once the rule of peaceful politics was broken, there was no going back. Violence became a new language of power. And so, the Republic died, not in a single blow, but in a long unraveling. A process that began with one man, Tiberius Gracchus, standing in the Forum, demanding justice. The story of Tiberius Gracchus is not simple ancient history. It is a warning. It tells us how inequality can corrode even the strongest republic, how tradition can give way to violence, and how one moment of bloodshed can echo across generations. Tiberius dreamed of restoring Rome's balance, of giving land to the dispossessed, of renewing the citizen army. Instead, his dream cost him his life and plunged Rome into an age of turmoil. But in death, he became something more, a symbol, a martyr, a man who, in challenging the powerful, revealed the fault lines that would eventually bring down the Roman Republic.